All right, folks, I'm going to get started. So welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the beginning of the fourth week together. So we are pretty much at the month point. Nothing's too serious yet, but we are definitely working towards the first exam. It's going to be coming up. Not quite yet, but in a few weeks it is coming. So I hope you are keeping up with the stuff we've been covering, building your knowledge foundation for learning the stuff we are continuing to learn so that you understand what we're learning. You don't need to backtrack, and you don't have like a bunch of things you need to learn right before an exam at the same time that you're learning a bunch of things for your other exams. So ideally, you are using your time wisely, and hopefully you'll have a comfortable semester because of it. So make sure that you're doing that. Um, Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. I hope everybody enjoys your Valentine's Day. It's definitely okay to keep enjoying your lives while you're in school, but definitely school should be your priority. It should be what you do, and everything else should be what you do when you are done doing this. So make sure that you are dedicating as much time as possible to doing the best you can here because, again, you signed up for it willingly, you're paying for it, nobody's forcing you to be here, and all of this is going to lead to something better for you in the future. So it is worth your time. And if you're not able to depend on yourself because you know that you will always take care of the things you need to take care of for yourself, then you're losing the most important person you have to depend on, which is yourself in this world. If nothing else is going right for you, if things are just hitting the fan left and right, at the very least, if you know that you can depend on yourself because you've laid a track record of that kind of experience for yourself, then everything turns out well. I had a really terrible time in the PhD program when up north for 5 years. It was ridiculous. It was just every day. It was like so much work, and it's like, and on top of that, there was just like life going on. So all that it was overwhelming, and it was unpleasant for 5 years every single day. But I knew that I was going to make it. Like I knew that I would get myself through it because I demonstrated to myself up until that point that like anything I take on that I conquer, I take down, and I did it. And I never had any doubt about it, not once, because of what I had accomplished up until that point. And I might have mentioned it before, but there were like, 14 of us that entered the program, and only 4 of us graduated in the end of that 5th year that we were scheduled to graduate. So it was a really difficult time, but I knew the entire time that I would get myself through it. So you need to have that. You need to build that for yourself. That like confidence that you can depend on you, because it will take you through this very challenging, difficult world that we all live in. And it will be the most valuable thing that you can cultivate. So everything you do here is partly about that. So don't get caught up in like, what is this one piece of information I'm learning going to do for me in the future? Like that is the wrong way to think about things. Like, how does this apply to what I'll be doing? And that's not the case. Like whatever it is you're being asked to do, like it doesn't matter. Do it the best you can. Later on, you are going to have the flexibility to choose what you want to do, how you want to do it, if you succeed now. And that's just the nature of what we all engage in this life. That's the nature of our society. Is it perfect? No, hell no, it's not perfect. Can it be better? Yes. Maybe in your lifetimes, you will be able to do things that will help make this whole thing better for all of us. But for now, you're at this stage, and regardless of what you think of it, regardless of whether you think it's the right approach or not, it doesn't matter. It is the approach that you're expected to take. So take it and run with it. Do your best within it. Demonstrate to the world and to yourself that you can be great at anything you take on. And that will be a great accomplishment in and of itself. All right, folks. So today we are going to move forward with the material. We're going to continue and finish Chapter 5. So we've been using our workhorse model that we use in economics, the supply and demand model. First understanding it, and now starting to kind of use it to like address things that could happen in markets. One of them is like the intervention of the government, and the government can institute what are called price controls or quota controls, in which they don't allow the market to set the price that it would naturally set, and either try to set it a little too high or below what the market would normally set. And then also the other approach is for the government to say, well, we can't have as much output as this market wants to have, right? We established early on that with supply and demand, you're going to have an equilibrium price and quantity. And so the government can play a role in trying to sort of offset what the market wants to do. So this chapter is just about kind of examining what those effects could look like with the model that we've been building up. And remember, on top of the model we've established, we also covered like a couple of other models in chapter 2. Make sure you understand how those works. Make sure you know the principles from chapter 1, all the terminology in all the chapters. And then, of course, the supply and demand model, consumer and producer surplus, and now this chapter. So today we'll finish chapter 5. Last time we talked about price ceilings. If the government sets a price below the equilibrium, basically saying the price cannot get higher than this particular price. We talked about the case of rent control. That's the main application where, you know, maybe like in a certain area, rents might get too high, and so then the inhabitants of the area might approach their representatives in Congress or their local government and say, hey, prices are too high, can you do something? And then that's when the government might come in and say, well, let's set a price below what the price in the market wants to be. So that was a case of a price ceiling. The price cannot go higher than it wants to. And now we'll look at the case of the price floor, where the price wants to go lower, but you know, based on the policies being enacted, the price is not allowed to go lower to the equilibrium point. We'll see what that looks like and the effects of it. And then finally, we'll look at the third case of the government attempting to control how much output is transacted in a market. So instead of allowing the market to reach that equilibrium quantity, the government says, no, there shouldn't be that much being supplied in this market. It should be less, and then we'll look at what kind of effects that has via, again, the same market model that we've been tracking so far. And then if there's time, we will start on chapter 6, which has to do with elasticity. Elasticity is just a measure of sensitivity of one variable to another. So like, how sensitive is quantity demanded to changes in price? If price changes by $1, will quantity demanded change by more than 1 unit, less than 1 unit, or by the same proportion, one to one? And so it's a measure that helps businesses sort of approach their markets that they're operating in. There's a very strong relationship between how elastic demand is, how responsive it is to price changes, and the revenues that firms can charge, whether they can raise prices or lower prices. So it's a powerful measure. We'll talk about the different types of elasticities that are relevant to this class, starting with just kind of defining what elasticity is in general, and just lightly touching upon how to measure it. And then on Thursday, we'll finish chapter 6. So then that will finish 6 chapters. And then I think chapter 7 will be next week. And then chapter 8 the following. And then the exam will be the week after that. So just keep that in mind. We are heading to a serious point in the course. And there is a practice exam online, which you can check out just to kind of get an idea of the structure and sort of the approach you should be having. Multiple choice questions will, again, cover the concepts, as I've talked about, like the terminology and the models, like the mechanics of the models. Anything that I've calculated, I would expect you to know, things of that sort. I'll keep talking about this stuff as we're moving forward, and definitely the week before the exam, I'll just kind of highlight what you should be, what you would expect on the day of the exam, whatever. But I, I need to mention it because, of course, we are moving towards it, and it's not just coming to class. Like, you have to demonstrate that you are playing your part in this whole thing, right? Like, I'm playing my part. My part is to come and lecture to you for 2.5 hours a week. I do that. Beyond that, you have a big role, and that is for you to learn this material, make sure you get it down, and then make sure that on exam days you can demonstrate that to me so I can give you the grade that you deserve. And you can walk away smiling from the course. So let's make sure that happens. Are there any questions about anything you'd like me to address, not related to the material, before I get started lecturing today's material? Alrighty. Then let us move forward. So previously, just really quick, what we covered from Chapter 5 last time. We talked about the fact that, again, there could be price controls, legal restrictions on how high or low a market price may go. Let me just turn off this light here so you clear. We talked about the fact that there could be a price ceiling or a price floor. Price ceiling, a maximum price sellers are allowed to charge for a good or service. Price floor, a minimum price buyers are required to pay for a good or service. So we considered the case of the price ceiling, and then we called it a day last time. So here's your standard market model. This was the market for apartments in New York City. We assumed all the apartments were the same, so there was no variation in price based on the specifics of the apartments themselves. You've got a downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. Price is on the y-axis, quantity is on the x-axis, and at the point where the two curves intersect, we get an equilibrium, a state of rest for the model, basically demonstrating the point that suppliers and demanders are like in full agreement. If we're not at this point, then there's either going to be a surplus or a shortage, and that's going to lead the market to go back to equilibrium. So we assume that the government imposed a price ceiling of $800, whereas the market wants to equilibrate at $1,000 rent. That was deemed in this hypothetical example as too high for the market, and so the government legislated an $800 price ceiling, the highest the rent can go in the market. And as a result of that, if you look at that price ceiling, you can see that quantity supplied, in this case, is going to be 1.8 million apartments versus quantity demanded, which is 2.2 million apartments. And so you're going to have an excess demand there of, in this case, 400,000 apartments at the price that's being set by the government. And normally, if there wasn't a price ceiling and the price was below equilibrium, then you have all these people up here that have a higher willingness to pay than what is being asked of the market. And you have these sellers up here that have a higher additional cost of supplying the good than what the price is compensating them for, and therefore they're not selling. But what happens when a price is below equilibrium, these people who value the good more than what is being charged will start bidding up the price. As they bid up the price, more sellers will enter the market that have their costs being met, and the market will reach equilibrium. So below the equilibrium, the price wants to go up, and that's where you would put a price ceiling. You would put it below it because, like, let's say the government doesn't want the price to go up, and therefore it would put the price ceiling below the equilibrium. If you put it above, it doesn't matter because up here the price wants to go down. So if you say the price can't go higher than 1,200, it'll go down naturally. It's pointless to put that up there. Anyway, so there's a price ceiling. It creates a shortage, in this case, of 400,000 apartments. And again, a price ceiling is only binding if it is below the equilibrium. It won't have any effect above the equilibrium. So yeah. If B moves up on the demand line, then that would mean that there was an excess of, there's an excess of housing, right? Because So you mean above this point? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So yeah, above here you're going to have an excess supply. Right? Yeah, you just look at the price, see how much demand there is at that price, and then see how much supply there is. Yeah, and then you can see, yeah, definitely, supply will outweigh demand above it. Yeah. All right, and we talked about how price ceilings cause inefficiencies. One is inefficiently low quantity of transactions occur in the market, as we saw in the example we're looking at, that only 1.8 million apartments are being transacted, whereas in equilibrium it would be 2 million. And so that difference here, in this case, 200,000 represents a loss of mutually beneficial transactions that would occur if there wasn't this kind of price control. As a result of that, we know that the way that we can measure the benefits from a market, the gains from trade, are via the consumer and producer surplus. The consumer surplus being the area below the demand curve and above the price, the producer surplus being the area below the price and above the supply curve. And we know that as a result of this price ceiling, that because there are 200,000 apartments not being transacted, that's going to represent a loss in consumer and producer surplus. And when you have that kind of loss in consumer or producer surplus because of some kind of intervention in the market that's not letting it equilibrate, we call it deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss is the loss in total surplus that occurs whenever an action or policy reduces the quantity transacted below the efficient market equilibrium quantity. So we're going to see that there's a deadweight loss from every kind of government intervention, both price ceilings, price floors, and the quantity controls that we'll look at. Another thing we noticed was that there's a difference between a deadweight loss and just like a shifting around of surplus. So like this is the full consumer surplus and the full producer surplus when a market is left alone to do what it does and behave the best it can. When there is a price ceiling, we see that we have this triangle, which represents a deadweight loss. We see that we have this rectangle here that was before part of the producer surplus, and that became part of consumer surplus. Remember, consumer surplus is the excess willingness to pay. It's the benefit to consumers of interacting in markets. All these consumers that are transacting in this market, because again, there's 1.8 million apartments available. That means that 1.8 million apartments are going to be consumed on the demand side. You have all these consumers who have an excess willingness to pay above the price, and so the difference between the demand curve and the price they pay is the consumer surplus. So this entire shape is the consumer surplus. And so part of the old producer surplus became consumer surplus, and that's what this rectangle represents. The consumer surplus transferred from producers, and the only producer surplus that exists under this price ceiling is this triangle here, the area below the price and above the supply curve. So it's important to understand like what's happening to the surpluses as the market is being sort of made inefficient due to some kind of intervention by the government. Now, again, like all of this is just meant to highlight the mechanics of these policies, but it doesn't necessarily establish like a clear-cut sort of good or bad outcome, because this is just an example. The world's more complicated. When you actually institute these kind of policies, sometimes the benefit outweighs the cost. There's a lot to consider here. Here we're just highlighting the nature of how the policy affects the market in the most simple general case possible, but it's not a rule of thumb. This is just meant for you to understand how the market model works and how we can use it to analyze certain situations and what the market model can tell us about the situation. But always when you're kind of drawing conclusions from it, always give the caveat that it is based on the simplicity of the model that you're getting these conclusions. All right, inefficient allocation to consumers is another problem that might happen as a result of this policy, in which people that value something more aren't getting it, whereas people that value something less might get it. So some people who want the good badly and are willing to pay a high price for it don't get it. Some who care relatively little about the good and are only willing to pay a low price do get it. So that's something that can result from a price ceiling. Wasted resources. People expend money, effort, and time to cope with the shortages caused by the price ceiling. So one example that was mentioned here was that there was a price ceiling instituted for gasoline in the 70s because there were issues in the Middle East that caused the supply of gas to shrink up a bit, which caused prices to soar. The government tried to intervene and stop the prices from getting too high. As a result of that, you had what we saw, which is a shortage. And so gasoline stations basically had huge lines of people waiting for gas. And so if you think about like the opportunity cost of that time, the amount of resources that one could be earning as a result of not being in line, being at your job or whatever, then that's an example of wasted resources that could result from a price ceiling. Inefficiently low quality. So sellers offer low quality goods at a low price, even though buyers would prefer a higher quality at a higher price. They can't pay that higher price. They can't pay what they actually value. So like in the case of rent control, you can have landlords that are just letting their apartments go to crap because they're just not spending money to uphold them because they are because of the price ceiling. So they lower their own costs of maintenance, right, in order to try to satisfy the benefit of renting out apartments, which is a lower rent that they would normally want for the apartments. And then finally, black markets. You can have some black markets where goods or services are bought and sold illegally, either because it is illegal to sell them at all, or because prices charged are legally prohibited by price ceiling. So you could have, kind of like weird markets that occur where maybe apartments are being transacted at higher prices, whereas they shouldn't be, and those prices are being set in terms of other things beyond just like money. So it creates a distortion in our ability to kind of uphold like one of the main pillars of our economy, of our society, which is like property rights. Like if laws aren't clearly laid out and we're not enforcing those laws properly, then it kind of all falls apart. And so problems. So price ceilings can cause problems. And then we talked about why there might be price ceilings as a result of acknowledging that there are these issues. One answer is that although price ceilings may have adverse effects, they do benefit some people. We talked about how certain people in certain markets, like they've been in maybe certain areas for a long period of time. Families have been there for generations, and then gentrification. Investors come into the area, start investing in the area, property values go up, rents go up, and then people that have been there for generations start to be priced out of the area. And the question is, as a society, are we okay with that? Are we okay with people being driven out of their communities due to these kind of forces? And so we have to wonder, what do we value more? And ultimately the political sphere is where that's decided, and that's another reason why you will have these kind of interventions by the government, even though sometimes you will have the kind of effects I mentioned here. So nothing is clear cut. These issues are complicated, and they should always be understood in complicated ways, and they should always be talked about in complicated ways. You can't simplify issues to one blanket statement. This is a bad thing and it should never happen. It's absurd to do that. We're dealing with issues that are complicated just based on their own effects, just based on what we're seeing with the market model, but also on the implications it actually has for actual people. And so all of that needs to be taken into consideration. So we talked about this already. And that's that. Okay, let's move on to now price floors. All right, so the other case is that a government institutes a price floor. They set a price above the equilibrium level to stop the price from being as low as the market wants it to be. So some governments intervene to push market prices up instead of down. So price floors have been widely legislated for agricultural products such as wheat and milk as a way to support the income of farmers. I mentioned before that, over the last couple hundred years, via our various industrial revolutions that we've experienced, that industrial farming has become like a large-scale operation industry where a lot of the independent farmers are driven out because the larger industrial farmers have lower costs, which we call economies of scale, which allow them to charge lower prices. Independent farmers can't charge such low prices, and so then they can't compete in these markets. So then the question was, like, are we okay with that? Well, the government said, no, we're not okay with driving all of these independent farmers out of business. We want to have an independent farming sort of domestic industry that's not completely dependent on like these international multinational corporate farming giants. And so in that case, you have a situation where a price floor was instituted in a lot of these agricultural markets. So if you've ever another example, if you've ever worked in a fast food restaurant, you're likely to encounter a price floor, which is the minimum wage. That's another example of a price floor. So governments in the U.S. and many other countries maintain a lower limit on the hourly wage of workers' labor. A minimum wage is a legal floor on the wage rate, which is the market price of labor. Just like ceilings, price floors are intended to help some people, but generate predictable and undesirable side effects. So let's look at what that looks like. So here's a hypothetical supply and demand for butter. Once again, price of butter on the y-axis, quantity of butter on the x-axis, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, equilibrium price and quantity set where the two curves intersect. Suppose the government, in order to help dairy farmers, imposed a price floor on butter at, say, $1.20 a pound. So the market wants to equilibrate at $1, but they set this price floor meaning the price can't go lower than that. It wants to, but it can't. Why does it want to? Well, when the price is above equilibrium, you've got an excess amount of supply. Here's the supply. Here's the demand. Demand does not satisfy supply, so there's a lot of butter being left on the shelves. And so then these suppliers start to lower their prices. These consumers whose willingness to pay was not being met enter the market. They start buying butter, and it gets them to equilibrium. So naturally, the market does want to get to that equilibrium point, but in the case of a price floor, the market's not allowed to. The government says, no, the equilibrium price is too low in the butter market. We got to keep our domestic farmers working. So we're going to set the price for butter higher than the equilibrium. So in this case, the price floor leads to a persistent surplus of 3 million pounds of butter. So you've got, at $1.20, you've got a quantity demanded of butter to be 9 million pounds and a supply of 12 million pounds of butter at, again, the price of $1.20, which gives us an excess supply of 3 million pounds of butter just being made, where at that price, you're not going to be able to sell that much. So that's what happens from a price floor. We'll talk about the effects of it a little bit in a second. But just to highlight the fact that a price floor is only binding when it is set above. So just as in the case of a price ceiling, the price floor may not be binding. It's only binding if it's set above equilibrium. If it's set below equilibrium and you say, well, the price can't go any lower than this price, we know that the market price wants to go up higher anytime it's below equilibrium, so you would not have a binding price floor below the equilibrium price. So again, just remember the distinction between a floor and a ceiling, where they land relative to the equilibrium price. All right, so how a price floor causes inefficiency. So again, we're going to examine the effects on total surplus, as the efficiency of the market. So like a price ceiling, a price floor creates inefficiency in at least 4 ways. One is inefficiently low quantity. Again, you're going to wind up with mutually beneficial transactions not occurring as a result of this price floor. Since the price floor raises the price of a good to consumers, it reduces the quantity of that good demanded. Price floors and price ceilings both have the effect of reducing the quantity of a good bought and sold. So again, you've got that price floor above, and therefore this is how much is being demanded. Therefore, that's how much is being purchased. So therefore, this is the amount that's being transacted in the market. In this case, 9 million pounds of butter. So you've got 1 million pounds of butter that would have been bought and sold had the market been left to equilibrate on its own. Doesn't happen. And therefore, that loss in mutually beneficial transactions can be quantified as a deadweight loss. Basically, again, we're losing a certain amount of consumer surplus and a certain amount of producer surplus because the mutually beneficial transactions don't occur due to the price floor. So consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand curve, above the price. So like, well, the demand curve goes all the way over here. So it's going to be the whole area below the demand curve. And then the producer surplus is, again, the excess willingness to sell, right? The price differential between what's being charged and what it costs the individual supplier to supply the unit of the good. So the surplus to like this seller here is going to be the difference between what it costs them to supply butter and what they get to charge, which is the price floor. And so the producer surplus is going to be kind of like a weird area again, and it's going to be below the price and above the supply curve again. So just like don't have a rule of thumb as far as like what they look like geometrically on the market model, the consumer and producer surplus. You have to be able to look at the market model and see what's happening in that market and then be able to identify what is the consumer surplus, what is the producer surplus. And you know that based on the definition and your understanding of the concepts, not just memorizing graphs. So it all has to connect, the words with the pictures. All right, so we know that it causes deadweight loss here. All right, another problem is inefficient allocation of sales among sellers. Just like we had inefficient allocation amongst buyers in the price ceiling case. So here in the price floor case, it can lead to inefficient allocation. Inefficient allocation of sales among sellers means that sellers who are willing to sell at the lowest price are unable to make their sales, while sales go to sellers who are only willing to sell at a higher price. So one illustration is a problem of unemployment and the black market for labor among the young in many European countries. So because prices are set high, and so you have so in a labor market, like the people that are offering their labor, like us that are looking to get work or whatever, we are supplying the labor. So we are the supply side, and the demand side is represented by whoever's hiring, like the employers, right? And so when you set a minimum wage above the equilibrium price in a market, then you wind up having that excess amount of supply, which means that there's a lot more people looking for work than there is jobs being offered. In that case, you're going to have a lot of unemployment. So Europe, if you look at different countries in Europe, they tend to have relatively high minimum wages. It's good to have a high minimum wage. It's good for us in this country to raise our minimum wage because wages have not been going up at the same pace as prices have been going up over time. So we need to raise our minimum wage in this country. In some countries, though, the minimum wage is set pretty high, and oftentimes it will be above the equilibrium, and you will get a lot of unemployment. You see it in Europe. Europe is great as far as like trying to take care of their folks, of their people, via like socialist policies. They offer education, medical care. A lot of things are offered by the government for free, essentially, and they have high price floors in labor markets, meaning high minimum wages. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is you wind up having a huge amount of unemployment and not a lot of jobs available for young people like entering the workforce. So oftentimes you're going to get a lot of, especially during hard economic times, you're going to get a lot of these young people just like kind of rising up and saying, hey, hold on a minute. Something has to change because we need opportunities as well. Because the people that are getting the jobs are actually getting really sweet jobs because they have really strong labor unions that wind up they wind up negotiating really high wages, which is how the minimum wage wound up being so high in a lot of these countries, which is great. But then there are adverse effects, bad effects to that, and we see that in the high unemployment, which leads to like social unrest in these countries a lot. You'll see a lot more sort of like right now we're seeing a lot of protesting in this country, and I'm really happy about that because we don't often see that in this country, especially in response to like the forces that are working against us, the majority of us. But in Europe, there's a strong tradition of people like standing up for themselves and hitting the streets and like standing up to power. And so you'll see a lot of demonstrations in Europe, but you'll also see like a lot of rioting. Sometimes it does get out of control, and oftentimes it will be as a result of like just too many young people not having enough work available to them. So it's a complicated issue, the minimum wage issue. It's not something that is clear cut ever, and it should always be examined very intelligently based on a case-by-case basis. Like you cannot have a rule of thumb to say it is bad to have a high minimum wage. It's I'm going to say it's ignorant to say that. You need to be very specific about what you're talking about. You're talking about one market versus another, because in general, we will have situations in this country where the minimum wage is actually below the equilibrium. And so it's okay to raise the minimum wage because it's not really going to affect most markets. Yes. Well, I mean, basically, what's the point of bringing that up is to say that like the average wage has not gone up, whereas the wage of like the highest earners in this country have gone up, and therefore, since their wages have gone up, then it makes sense for the wages of the average folk to go up via the minimum wage. Right, but you have to think about that number of CEOs. Like, how many is that relative to the entire population of workers? Like, it's minuscule, right? So it's just a reflection of the fact that like those at the very top of our society tend to benefit the most from like any kind of like improvement in our economy, and it's all about trying to sort of spread the wealth a bit and kind of say, well, everybody should be benefiting. If you look at the numbers very clearly as far as like how prices have been moving up in real terms, in terms of inflation adjusted terms, which is something you'll learn about in macro if you wind up taking that, then minimum wage has not been going up lockstep with prices in general, but you do see the wages of the highest earners going up. So there's a problem there, and so it needs to be resolved. And so that's why those things are mentioned. Did I answer your question? All right, well, you can talk to me more about it some other time if you want.
Can you elaborate more on, I'm not understanding, sellers who are willing to sell at the lowest price are unable to make sales if the prices are the lowest?
So you have to think about like people that are willing to work for less. They're not getting the jobs because only certain people are getting the jobs that are willing to work at the highest wage. So like people that have less, and the reason why people would be willing to work for less is because they don't have as many skills. So like the less skilled people are not being hired, whereas the more skilled people are being hired. But if there wasn't this kind of price floor, then it's likely some employers would hire the less skilled people at a lower price. So you have to think. It's just you have to think about it. Thinking about labor markets is slightly different. You just kind of have to put yourself in that mindset.
I'm thinking about when I read this, I'm thinking about farmers. Like, okay, if they sell apples at the lowest price, why are their apples selling?
So remember, they can't sell those apples, but this doesn't necessarily apply to those markets. Here they're talking more about like labor markets. Yeah. It's not saying that you will have these effects from all the policies, but you can have them in different cases of them. Yeah. So again, in Europe, a higher minimum wage has led to a two-tier labor system composed of the fortunate who have good jobs in the formal labor market that pay at least the minimum wage, and the rest who are locked out without any prospect of ever finding a good job. Many of these countries have seen their best and brightest young people emigrate, leading to a permanent reduction in the future performance of their economy. So that's one of the problems you see. You see people leaving their countries. But like recently, you may have heard about this whole Brexit thing, which is like Britain exiting the European Union. The European Union is something that was set up like few decades ago between most of the European countries, basically saying, well, within this sort of area that we've established, it's easy for workers to go in and out of our countries and work in any country. It's easy for us to buy and sell stuff from different countries without too many roadblocks. But Britain has now voted to get out of that. So that means that the workers in Britain won't be able to leave Britain to easily find a job in France and Spain or whatever. France, there are some, there's a lurking sort of potential propensity for them to also exit. There's a new conservative guy running for office who may win, and then he's talking about also leaving the European Union. So, you know, things might be changing in Europe for the worst. We'll talk more about how trade is beneficial. We've already talked about it slightly in very general terms. We'll talk about it a little bit more in chapter 8, the last chapter before the exam. But trade overall is beneficial, and the terms of trade, how we actually wind up deciding like who gets what, and like are people being taken care of in the countries that are poorer, like are labor conditions being set up that are reasonable for people that are working for American or foreign companies overseas. Like those issues are complicated and they need to be addressed. It's not perfect, but overall trade is a good thing, and for us to connect as a world is a good thing. And for us to be taking steps back is problematic. We see it in Europe. We're hearing it from Donald Trump. It's a really strange time because we've been progressing a lot over the last few decades, and it feels like now we might be at a bit of a standstill and maybe even taking a few steps back. But anyway, those are issues bigger than this course, but I just had to bring them up. All right, so wasted resources, just like I mentioned before with the people waiting in line under a price ceiling, you can have wasted resources under a price floor. The most graphic examples involve government purchases of unwanted surpluses of agricultural products caused by price floors. So when you have that surplus and the government wants to maintain that price, the only way they can do it is by buying up the excess amounts being produced. So they wind up buying a bunch of it. Some of it goes to like public programs, like public food programs, public school programs, etc. But oftentimes, like it'll just sit and rot, which is kind of weird and unfortunate, but it's real. It's reality. It's what happens. Price floors also lead to wasted time and effort. An example is would-be workers who spend many hours searching for jobs or waiting in lines in the hopes of getting jobs. So that's under the labor market price floor. Inefficiently high quality. So we had inefficiently low quality under the price ceiling. Under a price floor, you might have an inefficiently high quality. So that means that there are only quality goods at a high price available, even though buyers would prefer a lower quality, a lower price. So if there were like price floors in pencil markets, you could wind up with a $3,000 pencil made of solid gold that nobody would buy. That's the extreme case, obviously. High quality is generally a good thing, but only if it's worth the cost. This represents a missed opportunity. Suppliers and buyers could make a mutually beneficial deal in which buyers get goods of lower quality for a much lower price. So when you have prices set high and you have sellers selling that only produce high quality goods, then you're missing out on that opportunity for people to buy, like, you know, the cheaper apples or the cheaper butter or whatever that does the same thing. But again, the price floor doesn't allow the market to kind of just do what it normally does. This is actually number 5. Sorry, that should be number 5 there. And of course, illegal activity. Like price ceilings, price floors provide incentives for illegal activities. In countries where the minimum wage is far above the equilibrium wage rate, workers desperate for jobs sometimes agree to work off the books for employers who conceal their employment from the government or bribe the government inspectors. So also under those situations, people are not being taken care of, like their rights as workers aren't being enforced because obviously they're working under the table, and so that can create a problem. So then why are there price floors? The reasons are similar to those for imposing price ceilings. Government officials often disregard warnings about the consequences of price floors, either because they believe that the relevant market is poorly described by the supply and demand model, or more often because they do not understand the model. So So there is a disconnect between like the people that are actually deciding these things and the people that are able to analyze it. You'll have policymakers who have economic advisors who do present information to them, but the policymakers don't have to listen to them, or maybe will not clearly understand what is being presented to them, or they'll come up with some other reason to justify why they're willing to move forward with these kind of policies. So price floors are often imposed because they benefit some influential sellers. So sometimes you will get like some just really strong lobbies representing like certain sellers that have a lot of influence in Congress, and they will implement maybe like a price floor in a market where it just makes no other good reason. It makes no good sense to do it. There's no other good reason for it to happen. And it's all because of influence. So again, it has to do with our political system not being perfect, and more of you, people like yourself, needing to be involved in that political system. All right, let's look at the third case of government interventions in markets that could throw off the equilibrium and cause inefficiencies. This case is not about prices, it's about quantities. So controlling quantity. So if the government wants to say, we should not be transacting as many of these goods as there are, let's limit it to however many. Let's look at a case of that right now. So governments sometimes control quantity instead of price. In the 1930s, New York City instituted a system of licensing for taxi cabs. Taxis with a medallion were allowed to pick up passengers. So again, this is a market where you need a license to drive a taxi cab. This is before Uber and all this. It's just when it was just taxi cabs. These licenses were called medallions. At the time when they were instituted in the 1930s, there were 11,787 medallions issued, and the taxi owners paid $10 for each of those medallions. In 1995, nearly 65 years later, there were still only 11,787 taxi medallions in New York City. An additional 400 medallions were issued in 1995, which resulted in several more rounds of selling, bringing the total medallions up to 15,000 medallions. The result is that today a medallion is worth over $1 million. So just the right to drive a taxi cab in New York City costs $1 million. Other cities have followed suit, with medallions in San Francisco, Chicago also selling for over 7 figures. So essentially in this market you have a quantity control. The market wants more quantity, right? People want there to be more taxis. Before this wonderful blessing we all got of like Uber and Lyft, use Lyft instead of Uber these days, by the way, just for political reasons. But before we had that, like, it was ridiculous. Like, you wanted to go like just a few blocks, it cost you like $30. It was ridiculous. Like, the prices were absurd, and it all has to do with the fact that like the licenses to drive taxis in all of these cities have been limited by quantity controls. And as a result of that, I'll demonstrate how the drivers are able to charge such high prices for their fares. Fortunately, now there's more competition for taxi companies, via this wonderful new system we have in our sharing, in this new aspect of our sharing economy, where we are sharing our resources in our markets. So people are using their own cars and their own time to drive other people around. It's great. We should have come up with this like 50 years ago, but whatever. We have it now. It's fantastic, and prices have gone down. You can depend on these services now to, take you, downtown or whatever, or wherever you're going to go. Maybe you're going to go hang out with your friends. Maybe you want to have a few drinks. You don't want to deal with driving. Uber, Lyft, whatever. Whereas before, it's like if you wanted that, you had to kind of add a huge premium to your night to be able to afford a taxi cab home. So things have definitely improved. But again, the price of taxi cabs were as high as they were, and still high, but not as high as before, due to quantity controls. So a quantity control, or a quota as it's also known, is an upper limit on the quantity of some good that can be bought or sold. The quota limit is the total amount of the good that can be legally transacted. And the license gives its owner the right to supply a good. In this case, to supply taxi rides. All right, so let's look at what the effects of a quantity control can be on a market via our market model analysis. So again, you've got downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, price of taxi cabs, which is the fare per ride on the y-axis, quantity of rides, in this case millions per year on the x-axis, the flat axis. Here is the quantity demanded at different prices. We again see as prices go down, quantity demanded increases, reflecting the law of demand. As price goes down, quantity supplied decreases, reflecting the law of supply. All right, to understand why New York medallions are worth so much money, let's consider a simplified version of the market for taxi rides. Here it's assumed that all the taxi rides are the same, so we're not thinking about different lengths. We're just thinking about like the same taxi ride in the same kind of taxi, and that's it. Taxis can offer as many rides as they want. To simplify analysis, we assume that a medallion system limits the number of taxi rides to let's say 8 million per year. So that is our quota limit, 8 million per year. Now, a way to understand the concept better is to think of what's called the demand price. So the demand price of a given quantity is the price at which consumers will demand that quantity. So basically, you look at a specific quantity and then you go up to the demand curve and see what price folks are willing to pay, and then that is the demand price. It's just a different way of looking at the demand curve. We've been looking at how much is quantity demanded at different prices. So we've been looking at a price and then seeing what quantity demanded is. So this is just the opposite way of looking at it. So there's the demand price. Until now, we've derived the demand curve by answering questions of the form. How many taxi rides will passengers want to take if the price is $5 per ride? So that's what we've been doing so far. So just to analyze this properly, we look at it the other way around with the demand price. So we reverse the question here and ask what price would a certain quantity be demanded at? And then we have the same thing for the supply price. The supply price of a given quantity is the price at which producers will supply that quantity. So you just look at any quantity and then go up to the supply curve and see what is the price producers would supply that quantity at. That's the supply price. Again, it's just a different perspective on the same thing we've already been talking about. All right, so now we have what we need to analyze the quota. All right, so medallion holders may either drive their own taxis or they could rent their medallions to others for a fee. So you see in New York and all the municipalities where there are medallion systems that, you'll have these big corporations like that obviously have people working for them driving their taxis. And it's the corporations that hold the medallions, and they're essentially renting out those licenses to the individual drivers. All right, so again, we're going to say that the quota limit is 8 million per year, so it's going to be set right here. We see that at 8 million, the supply price is $4 and the demand price is $6. Because the quantity of rides is limited to 8 million, consumers must be at point A on the demand curve. So the demand price of 8 million rides is $6 per ride. So that's the price that consumers are willing to pay for 8 million rides. Meanwhile, taxi drivers must be on point B on the supply curve. So the supply price of 8 million rides is $4 per ride. All right, so the question is, but how can the price received by taxi drivers be $4 when the price paid by taxi drivers is $6? So you've got this, what's called a wedge between the two. So the answer is that in addition to the market in taxi rides, there's also a market for the medallions. We don't see the market here, but there is a market for medallions. There's a supply of medallions. There's a demand of medallions, and then there's an equilibrium price being set in that market for the right to drive a taxi cab. So medallion holders may not always want to drive their taxis. They may be ill or on vacation. So those who do not want to drive their own taxis will sell the right to use the medallion to somebody else. So we need to consider two sets of transactions here, and thus two prices. So the first one is the transactions in actual taxi rides and the price at which those will occur. So Whoever has a medallion will be driving taxis, will be supplying taxis. People needing rides will be demanding taxis. The other transactions, the other prices and transactions we need to consider are the transactions in medallions and the price at which those will occur. So it turns out that since we are looking at two markets, the $4 and the $6 will both be right. So to see how this all works, consider two imaginary New York taxi drivers, Sunil and Harriet. Sunil has a medallion but can't use it because he's recovering from a severely sprained wrist. Harriet doesn't have a medallion but would like to rent one. To make things simple, we assume that any driver can give only one ride per day and that Sunil is renting his medallion to Harriet for 1 day. So then the question is, what price will they agree on? So to answer the question, we need to look at the transactions from the viewpoints of both drivers, both Sunil and Harriet. So once Harriet has the medallion, she knows that she can make $6 per day because we're assuming only one taxi ride that day. So she knows that she can get that $6 for offering that one taxi ride, which is the demand price of a taxi ride under our 8 million taxi ride quota limit. As she is willing to rent, and she is willing to rent the medallion only if she makes at least $4 per day, which is the supply price of a ride under the quota. So this is what it costs an individual taxi driver to supply the actual ride, right? Like they have to pay for the gas, like they have an opportunity cost to their time, etc. So she needs to at least be compensated for her $4. She knows she can collect $6 from the taxi ride. Sunil cannot demand a rent, which is the difference between the demand price and the supply price. And it's the price that he would charge her in order for her to be able to drive the taxi. He can't demand more than $2, right? Because that's the most that she will benefit from a taxi ride. So if Harriet offered Sunil less than $2, let's say she offered him $1.50, there would be other eager drivers willing to offer him more, up to $2. So again, we're talking about just a standard market where if she were to offer something less than the price that could be gotten by Sunil, which is the equilibrium price in that market for medallions, then there would be somebody else with a higher willingness to pay that would offer that $2, and therefore she couldn't offer Sunil less than the $2. Since the rent can't be no more than $2 and no less than $2, then it must exactly be those $2. All right, so the wedge here is the difference between the demand price and the supply price present in every case in which the supply of a good is legally restricted. It's the price paid by buyers and ends up being higher than that received by the sellers. The quota rent is the earnings that accrue to the license holder from ownership of the right to sell the good. It's equal to the market price of the license when the licenses are traded. And again, you could figure out what that is by looking at the quota, seeing what the demand price is versus the supply price, getting the difference between the two. Well, the difference between the two will be represented by this wedge, and that will give us the quota rent. Yeah, the difference between the demand price and the supply price at the quota amount. Remember, this is the legal restriction that the government's setting for the market on how many taxi rides can be offered in the market. So in the case of Sunil and Harriet, the quota rent of $2 goes to Sunil because he owns the license, and the remaining $4 from the total fare of $6 goes to Harriet to meet her marginal cost or cost of supplying that ride. But what if Sunil doesn't rent out his medallion and uses it himself? Does this mean that he gets the $6? So we always have to consider in this class that we are talking always about opportunity costs, not just like explicit costs. So even if Sunil doesn't rent out his medallion, he could have rented it out, which means that the medallion had an opportunity cost of those $2. So if he doesn't rent out the medallion, he is giving up $2. So that's part of his cost. So therefore, if he winds up driving himself, he winds up with the cost of the car of $2, of supplying the ride in the car of $4, and then the difference between the demand price and the supply price, the wedge, the quota rent, will also be part of his cost. It'll just be an implicit cost, like a cost that he is not incurring because he is not selling his. I'm sorry, it's a benefit he's not incurring, which winds up being a cost because he is not renting out his license. So remember, we talked about opportunity cost. I'm going to talk about it a lot in this class. I'll keep reminding you of what we're talking about. Opportunity cost equal implicit plus explicit cost. You have an opportunity cost of being in college. Your explicit costs are your tuition, the books, your apartment, things you're paying with money. So that's your explicit cost. Your implicit cost is what you're giving up to be here. So while you're here, you're not making your wages at some job, whatever. So you have an implicit cost. So your opportunity cost, what we in economics consider your costs, are the sum of both your implicit and explicit costs. Your opportunity cost of going to college is the sum of your wages foregone plus what you're paying out to actually go to college. So again, for him, he has an explicit cost of the taxi rides, and if he were not to rent out his medallion, he has an implicit cost of the rent that he could have made had he rented it out. All right, let's talk about the cost of quantity controls. Like price controls, quantity controls can have some predictable and undesirable side effects. The first is the problem of inefficiency due to missed opportunities. So inefficiencies due to missed opportunities are represented by what is called what? Deadweight loss, exactly. And what is deadweight loss? Decrease in total surplus, which is made up of consumer and producer surplus. Very good, yes. So we're going to get a loss of producer and consumer surplus due to the quota. So again, the market would have been in equilibrium here at 10,000 rides. The government sets the limit at 10 million. The government sets the quota of taxi rides at 8 million, which means there's 2 million that would have happened. Had they happened, this would have been the equilibrium price. You would have gotten some extra consumer surplus by all these buyers that would have paid for it that aren't going to be paying for it because the price is too high for them. And all these sellers that aren't going to be selling because the marginal cost of selling is below the price that they would charge. And thus, as a result of that, you're going to wind up with deadweight loss. Generally, as long as the demand price of a given quantity exceeds the supply price, there's going to be a deadweight loss. Also, because there are transactions that people would like to make but are not allowed to, quantity controls generate an incentive to evade them or even to break the law. There are substantial numbers of unlicensed cabs that simply defy the law by picking up passengers without medallions. So that's something that does occur as well. Black markets for the good that's being limited. All right. So that is the end of chapter 5, and we do have time to start chapter 6. So let's start on it. It's better to get ahead rather than not to get ahead, folks. Believe me. All right. So again, we are expanding on concepts related to the market model. So everything that we're doing is connected. Even from the beginning we had those principles that underlie the logic and approach of economics, why we can get to these models and say these are the models that are accurate, that do represent the concepts we want to highlight in our discipline of microeconomics. Then we start introducing like the basic models, and models that in general kind of gave us an idea of why we use models, right? So we looked at the production possibility frontier, which got us to the notion of comparative advantage, meaning that those that have the lowest opportunity cost should specialize in doing whatever they have the lowest opportunity cost in, and then everybody will trade those things that they produce that they are best at producing. So we talked about those models and highlighted the results of those models, but also the value of using models in general. Then we went into our specific model, supply and demand, highlighted the nature of that model, went into consumer and producer surplus, highlighted the nature of like this important concept that we can use, that we can take from the market models to gauge the benefit of markets. Then we expanded it. the model to apply it to the case of government interventions and showed how government interventions can affect markets using the concepts of producer and consumer surplus. So, like I said before, like it seems like a lot of chapters, but it really isn't. Like they're all really kind of like 2 or 3 chapters. Like if you go beyond this course, all these concepts are covered in like 2 or 3 chapters. So don't feel overwhelmed by it. Just try to kind of stay, like keep your minds within like those things that are unifying everything. And the only way to do that is by really staying on top of it and just kind of tracking it, seeing where the connections lie and sort of where the branches go and how those branches are connected. Here again, we're going to continue using the market model. We're going to learn why economists use this elasticity measure to measure responsiveness to changes in prices or income. We're going to talk about why the price elasticity of demand, the income elasticity of demand, and the cross-price elasticity of demand are important indicators of consumer behavior in response to changes in prices and income. We'll talk about why the price elasticity of supply is an important indicator of producer behavior in response to changes in price. So you can use elasticities to measure responsiveness of all sorts of things. We can look at how producers are responding to changes in prices, not just how consumers respond to changes in prices, not just how consumers respond to changes in income, which we'll also look at in this chapter, and how they respond to changes in prices of related goods like substitutes and complements. We have elasticities to measure those, so we'll look at those in this chapter as well. We'll talk about what factors influence the size of these various elasticities as well. So I want to make sure I can define and talk about measuring elasticity, and then kind of leave you with that so that you can have that to kind of think about. And next time we'll definitely go into the more precise cases. And in this chapter, there'll be some calculations as well that I'll expect you to be able to do. So make sure you can start sort of figuring out how to do those things. All right, so let's talk about the price elasticity of demand. The price elasticity of demand is the ratio of the percent change in the quantity demanded to the percent change in the price as we move along the demand curve. How much are people responding to changes in price at low quantity demanded versus higher quantity demanded? Well, price elasticities of demand can give us an indicator of that. It is a measure of price responsiveness. So at point A here, we see that at a price of $20, people are demanding, in this case, we're looking at quantity of ambulance rides. People are demanding 10 million ambulance rides. At a price of $21, people are demanding 9.9 million ambulance rides, less. Law of demand, price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Things are working the way they're supposed to. But we see that the curve, along the curve, that things don't necessarily seem like they're going to be constant. Things might be changing along it, and that is the case. The responsiveness of people to prices change along demand. And the demand itself also gives us an indication of how responsive people are to prices in markets. To calculate the price elasticity of demand, we first calculate the percent change in the quantity demanded and the corresponding percent change in the price as we move along the demand curve. All right, so the percent change in quantity demanded is equal to the change in quantity demanded divided by the initial quantity demanded times 100. Right, you're at some starting point. You see how much has changed. So how much has how much is that change relative to where you started from? Multiply that by 100, that gets you to a percent change. This is just a general percent formulation, meaning this is how you just normally calculate a percent. When we get to actually calculating elasticities, there's going to be a special method that's going to slightly change this, but this is your starting point. This is where we assume you are starting from as far as your understanding of how to calculate percent change based on math courses you did take throughout your lives. All right, percent change in price. Change in the price divided by the initial price, the starting price, times 100. All right, so in the figure we see when the price rises from $20 to $21, the quantity demanded falls from 10 million to 9.9 million rides. And this yields a change in the quantity demanded of 0.1 million rides, or in this case, 100,000 rides. So we can examine what those percent changes look like. So we can do a percent change in the quantity demand. It's going to be the change in the quantity demanded, which we know is going to be 0.1 million. And we know that it's a reduction, so I put a negative there. Divided by the initial starting amount, which is 10, multiplied by 100. So if you were to plug this into your calculator, you would wind up with negative 1%. So the quantity demanded of ambulance rides has decreased by 1% as a result of an increase in price of $1. Now let's look at the percent change in the price. The initial price is $20 and the change in price is $1. So you have the percent change in price equals that change in price, which is $1, divided by the initial price, which is $20. So 1 divided by 20 times 100. If you plug that into your calculator, you'll get, in this case, a 5% change in price. So we see that as a result of a 5% change in price, there is a 1% change in quantity demanded, a 1% drop in quantity demanded, represented by the negative sign there. Yeah, decrease, right? Because remember, we're talking about demand. It's always going to be one moving up, the other moving down. So in the figure, the price elasticity of demand is therefore going to be the ratio of the percent change in quantity demanded to the percent change in price, which in this case equals 1% change in quantity demanded over 5% change in price. If you plug those into your calculator, you wind up with a price elasticity of demand to be equal to 0.2. All right, so notice the negative sign has been dropped from the percent change in quantity demanded. The law of demand says that demand curves are downward sloping, so price and quantity demanded always move in opposite directions. This means that the price elasticity of demand is, strictly in mathematical terms, always a negative number. So I don't need to keep putting the negative in there because we're talking about a concept that will always be negative. As there's a percent change in price, let's say it goes up, quantity demanded will drop by a certain percent change. So there'll be a negative in there. Or if the price goes down, which is a negative drop, the quantity demanded will increase, so that will be positive. So positive over a negative is a negative. So no matter what, the price elasticity of demand will always be negative. So I don't need to always show it because it's implicit in the concept. All right, so it's inconvenient to repeatedly write a minus sign. So when economists talk about the price elasticity of demand, they usually drop the minus sign and report the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand. Absolute value, for those of you that don't remember, is the distance of any number from 0 on a number line, right? So negative 5 has an absolute value of 5. Negative 0.05 has an absolute value of 0.05. 5 has an absolute value of 5. In this case, economists would usually say the price elasticity of demand is 0.2, taking for granted that you understand this means minus 0.2. We follow this convention in this course. The larger the price elasticity of demand, so the larger this number is, the more responsive the quantity demanded is to price. When the price elasticity of demand is large, when consumers change their quantity demanded by a large percentage compared to the percentage change in the price, then economists say that demand is highly elastic. We say demand is highly elastic if this number is large. As we'll see shortly, a price elasticity of 0.2 indicates a small response of quantity demanded to price. This is what economists call inelastic demand. Inelastic demand allows a producer to raise prices and increase the amount earned. So if you have inelastic demand, it means that a large percent change in price will lead to a small percent change in quantity demanded. That means that producers can then raise prices without it affecting quantity demanded too much, which means that their revenues will increase. So how elastic demand is has a strong relationship to revenue, which I will highlight in our next class. And I'll also talk about in the next class an alternative way to calculate elasticities, the midpoint method, which is the way you're going to be expected to actually calculate it. So this other stuff is just preliminary kind of build-up stuff. I'm glad I got it out of the way today. Have a great Valentine's Day, everybody. Enjoy yourselves, but work hard. I will see you on Thursday.